Last bit of JavaScript, single-page apps and JSON. So what are single-page apps? These are things where you kind of load the page once, and after that you don't load the page again. Everything else pretty much happens through Ajax. Pivotal Tracker is kind of an example. But again, the big message here is you already know all of the flows that are used to do this. The only real difference is that the rendered content from the server is handed to your JavaScript code, not to the browser. So as we saw, the controller method doesn't have to render a full page with its layout. It could render a bit of HTML. It could render raw text. But in this case, what most single-page apps want to do is return a data structure. And what do you use to return a data structure? Well, it used to be XML, but JSON has really kind of taken over because you can parse it directly in JavaScript, right? You can take a JSON object and essentially consume it without having a separate parsing library just for that. So because most things that are doing Ajax are client-side JavaScript code, JSON has become the overwhelmingly popular way to transmit them. And again, the change from a regular controller method to one that can return a JSON object is trivial. All we've done here is, once again, we find a particular movie. And now we're going to render JSON if the request is an XHR request. So what does render JSON actually do? It calls the method to_JSON on this object. As you might expect, Active Record defines a default version of that method for you that essentially serializes all of the properties from your database into a JSON object. So if you do nothing, generally speaking, you'll get something sensible by rendering a JSON representation of most of your Active Record models. If you want to do something more complicated, all you have to do is override the toJSON method in your model. You can make it render whatever you want, as long as you end up with a data structure that goes back to the client. So what would client-side code look like that was designed to work this way, as opposed to what we did before, which is the server sending back a chunk of HTML, and we're just going to kind of shove that into the page somewhere. Now we're getting back a data structure. So what might the code do differently in that case? And here's an example of it. So here's the same show movie info function that we had before, and the only difference is, if you remember last time, what we did with movie info is we just stuck in here the data that was returned from the server. In this case, what we're doing with movie info is we're getting some JSON data from the server, right? So remember that when we get a callback, the first argument is whatever the server sent back to us. I called it JSON data because, to me, it helps make obvious in the code that what this callback function expects from the server is a JSON object, as opposed to HTML or as opposed to a raw string. But there's nothing magic about the name I chose. I just tried to choose a name that is suggestive of what I'm going to do with it. And what does the JSON data look like? Well, like I said, Active Record by default will just create a JSON object whose properties match the attributes of your Active Record model. In the case of movies, you remember that one of the properties is description. There's also a title, there's a rating, and so on. So in this case, I'm just going to construct an HTML paragraph element that includes that text. I'm going to wrap it with secret jQuery powers, and then I can append it to this movie info div, which started out empty. So basically, it's the same structure. All I've done is modify my callback function so that instead of receiving HTML and shoving it somewhere, it receives a data structure, uses the contents of that data structure to create a piece of HTML, and then displays the HTML. So of course, in both cases, the common denominator is ultimately the thing you display has to be HTML and CSS. So you make an architectural choice. Is it easier for you to just generate that HTML directly on the server, send it back and shove it in? Or is it easier to generate data structures on the server, send back the data structures, and then have JavaScript code in the client that takes those data structures apart and creates HTML out of them? And it's really just a matter of what you're expecting your JavaScript client-side code to do. But again, the real issue is there's not much going on, right? There's not much different from what you've seen. The number of changes necessary to actually get to a JSON API is quite small. A lot of the work is done for you. All of the server-side mechanisms are ones that you already understand. So that's a really simple example of a single-page app. We don't expect that you'll be doing things like Google Maps in this course, but basically the mechanisms are all there, right? At the end of the day, you still are writing a server that expects HTTP requests and returns data over HTTP. Sometimes it'll return HTML views. Sometimes it'll return data structures encoded in JSON, or possibly, although less frequently these days, in XML. Or you might even just return a raw string because you know that that particular Ajax call is expecting to just get a raw string, and it's going to replace the contents of some existing paragraph with it, right? So even those simple cases work well sometimes. So let's see if you can figure out, based on that discussion, which, if any, of the following statements are true regarding JSON objects in Rails apps. the object's properties must exactly match. So this is referring to when you return a JSON object from a controller method serving an AJAX request. The JSON object's properties must exactly match the corresponding active record model. If you have an association, like movie has many reviews, the owned objects, in this case the reviews, have to be returned in one or more separate JSON objects. In other words, you can't just have one big blob that includes the owning object and the owned objects. The JSON objects can only be consumed by a JavaScript-capable client, or maybe none of the above are true. Maybe all of these are false, or sometimes false.